I want to share with you is what I've been doing, or what I've had the privilege to do for about, for 13 years, through a small museum. And on your note about the importance of museums, but the importance of the scholarly research that you do. For example, just Curating Race and Indigeneity and the Public Culture Museum's representation of community engagement. I'm sitting there going, what can I share? What do I have to share? And I started off with just writing down my thoughts. And the first thing that, after thinking about it for a while, I want to read this. How does one curate one's culture when they have been systematically and thoroughly raped of their language, displaced in their lands, and culturally exterminated? These are harsh words, but even harsher realities of indigenous peoples who are living with these on a daily basis. We continue to live with this information, live with this living knowledge. And what I want to talk about next is how we've always been viewed or treated. This is in the 1960s. Go back. How we were viewed, change our clothing, we become civilized. All right, so, and I lived in Siberia, and I had this kind of clothing. I froze my butt off. I put reindeer traditional clothing, I stayed warm. So I know these guys probably froze with the first year they did this and then changed their clothing back. But how we were viewed, what was done with us, it's like, to where we are today. And I'm going to read from Thomas Berger. It's a title of his book called The Long and Terrible Shadow. It is important for us to know something about that history. In 1992, we commemorated the 500th anniversary of Columbus's landfall and triumph of the European enterprise in the New World. The history that we have celebrated in this history of progress we have made, that progress has been made at the expense of the Indians. For them, that history is one of suffering, of massacre, disease, and devastation. Europe has cast a long and terrible shadow over the native peoples of the New World. Today, they are emerging from beneath that shadow, and they have a tale to tell, not only of subjugation, but also of survival. But they still live among us, and they have a claim on our conscience, a claim that we should honor the principles by which we profess to live. If we are to understand who we are, we must know about the history of our encounter with the native peoples of the America. And when I was reading that in preparation for this presentation, I tried to think about how can I relate this to the importance of what our museums, what our cultural centers are sharing. But more importantly, the knowledge and information we have to share within our community. Our past, our history, our present, our responsibility. It's our responsibility to share that history, no matter how harsh it is. In Kodiak, Alaska, or in Alaska itself, Captain Cook came to looking for the Northwest Passage in 1778. When he came up, he spent time in the Prince William Sound. And what's important about Captain Cook's journals is, he writes some very important things. If you have a chance, read his officers' journals, because they're writing exactly what they see. They're not hiding anything. They came to Prince William Sound, which in Alaska is right here, right up here. I'm from Kodiak, was right about here, and then they sailed down to the Aleutians in June. But when they came to the Prince William Sound, they still had their open boats, they had all their sea otter skins, they had their weapons to defend themselves, and when Cook's crews tried to entice the women onto the boat, the women were like, bugger off, go away, we're not going to do what you want. Okay, so then they sailed down to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, where the Russians had already been there since 1741, but more in the 1760s. Next. And here, I read from this, I start from the top, and this is Samuel's journals. Through them, which we descended down a ladder made of a thick piece of wood with steps cut in it, into a dark and dirty cave seemingly underground, where our noses were instantly saluted with a potent stink of putrid fish which was scattered about the house. We were welcomed into these murky caves by the master of the house and his wife and other females sitting together in one part of the hut. Having been used to many strange scenes since we left England, we spent no time in staring about us with vacant astonishment, but immediately made love to the handsomest woman in company. who in order to make us welcome, refuses no favor she could grant, though her husband or father stood by. Having thus paid proper attention to the women, we had time to look about us and admire the structure and furniture of these strange habitations. And this is a couple of different times that I've read this, read references to this. And I'm sitting there going, made love. Okay, so they went in and they raped it. Well, in the Aleutians, they had no weapons to defend themselves. Their open boats were gone. Their large boats to be able to move. And no more sea otter skins. The men had been forced to go out and hunt sea otters for the Russians. But to me, I look at this and I start to think about they demasculized and well, they basically cut any authority off from the men. And the women carried forward that. And I see this at home. But how do you prove that? How do you show that? How do you understand that history of atrocity? And 6 years later, the same thing happened in Kodiak with the Russians coming in 1784. Next slide. This is what Weber drew after those men did that. I mean, I really, go back. I really appreciated this until I read that quote. This is what they portrayed from that scene. And as an archaeologist, as somebody who studies material culture, this is an important sketch. But as a native person, this is a crime scene to me. It's a scene that says, this is what they want you to see, but the reality is quite different. And you know, I can't look at this the same anymore. Same thing, same issues. As historians, we tend to gloss over these. This one here is talking about in 1805, by 1818 we lost about 90% of our people in Kodiak. But 1805, over 300 men were drowned. And I'm going to come back to that when I talk about the Kiksadi tribe. But there, and then the second paragraph, a compassionate human being can hardly restrain his tears, observing the situation of these unhappy people who resemble the dead more than the living. Nobody ever talks about the starvation that happened. Nobody talks about that in the historical accounts. They gloss over it. I've run into 3 different references, historical references, but that's it. In Kodiak, during the Russian period, during Baranov's reign. Next slide. And as you start to pick pieces of history, you read these snippets, it's important to share them. Don't be afraid to share it, because it's a painful part of our history. But that painful part of our history we're still living with. We sort of just bury it. Let's ignore it. No, we should not ignore it. It's a snapshot of our history, the open boats, the clothing, the treatment of our women, the loss of the ability to protect our families. We're having to rebuild from this destruction. You know, and these discounts, and looking at these accounts are very important. And it's part of our history. These are facts. We can't go back and change that. We have to understand the legacy of these generations of loss, the Russian historical accounts. They give us a snapshot of what happened. Up until 1992, next slide. Up until 1992, a lot of us in Kodiak never knew about this. The slide up on the left-hand side here, this is Refuge Rock, or what we call a WOW. And we only rediscovered that site in 1991. We excavated in 1992. That's where Russia claimed Alaska. That's where we lost our ability to govern ourselves as a people. Up until 1784, all the Russian Permysonikies, the hunters, the fur traders, would skip Kodiak because we were too organized. But they came with cannon and muskets. And what they then did is they took the women and children hostage and told the men, you're going to do what we tell you or they're going to die. And any man who loves his family will protect them to his death. And that was the same at home. And that's how they were able to subjugate all the way across Russia, into Alaska, and even down to Fort Ross. Next slide. But we still have these practices. We still practice a traditional way of life, subsistence. We gather bird eggs, we gather plants, we split fish. We still live this way today. Next slide. And we celebrate it. the 4th of July. We celebrate Christianity. We run multi-billion dollar corporations and boats. We've adapted to our situation where we are now, but we have not started to explore the history that we still live with. I mentioned, and I bring up the Christianity, the Russian Orthodox. If it wasn't for the Russian Orthodox priests speaking up and saying something against Verona, I wouldn't be standing here. Those are priests who risked their lives to say, no, you cannot do that. And so it's important to acknowledge that part of that history as well. Next slide. To 1995, there was a museum that was founded called the Burke Museum, which I had the privilege to run and manage for 13 years. And in that, we've done community archaeology, and then we're doing language, what we call preservation, but it's not preservation. I started to rethink that, because it's living language. We're celebrating our language and trying to keep it alive. We have less than 25 fluent speakers. But in the 13 years I had the privilege of working in the museum, this young lady here, she finished her degree from Brown in 2000, came to Kodiak, and she's from Kodiak. From 2000 to 2012, I was able to help her while she was had a full-time job through the museum to work to get her job, PhD in linguistics. So growing our own, consciously making a choice to say, okay, you have a full-time job, but we're going to make this work for you so that you can start to have a voice and keep that voice alive. Growing our own in our own communities, even at a small scale, that voice becomes a shout. Next. Two, one of the things I'm really passionate about. I like to talk, but I also like to show. Traveling traditions. One of the things that we have is we have archaeological collections, we have ethnographic collections. But if I can show you how to make something from our culture, I start to instill that history. I start to embody that knowledge. And what I look at it is planting seeds of change for life. Change that change that none of us can ever take away from that youth or our adults. Next slide. So in the 13 years we've done bentwood bowls, mass carving, Alutiiq games, fishkin sewing, working with traditional elders, working with museum collections. But by showing them, they embrace that knowledge. They then just start to ask more questions. They become empowered. And what I push is repatriation of knowledge. Next slide. Taking that knowledge so it's knowing and living. And when we were doing this piece here is from an archaeological collection. And we were carving these combs, and I thought, they're combs. And then until the young lady on top, my cousin, Michaela, put that in the back of her hair. I'm like, it's an adornment. It's to make her look more beautiful. And if you look at those there, it's important. It's like, from an archaeological perspective, we call it a comb. But it's for her beauty. And one of the things I do like to do is practice. These are my daughters, where, teaching them as well. Next. To working with other artisans, celebrating what they know, learning from the archaeological material, learning from the ethnographic collections, and putting it back into a living context. By creating that, next slide, the Kodiak Island in itself has created these camps where we're doing language, where we're doing dancing, where we're doing fishing, traditional subsistence. Now, we've adapted to a modern society where we're all working 9 to 5, but we're able to send our kids out to these camps where they can learn about this history. They come back and then start asking their parents. Their parents then want to get more involved. Because then they're like, well, why didn't I have that? Well, how can I learn more about it? And that's where the museum has been really important in terms of having that knowledge as a base for sharing this. To documenting petroglyphs, as a south camp at the south end of Kodiak that we go to every year for the last 13 years. Next slide. Where we documented, originally we had thought, 400 petroglyphs. We're now at 1,300 petroglyphs. And it's the largest grouping of petroglyphs in Alaska that we know of right now. but creating petroglyphs so that we can have them in the city of Kodiak, so that our community can celebrate it, native and non-native. So bringing that living knowledge that people don't have access to back into our community. Next slide. To looking at what happened and understanding the history. Kodiak, between 1784 and 1867, all our objects were taken to Europe. There's a few pieces at the Smithsonian, but not much from Kodiak. In Russia, the next slide. Well, actually, I want to step back first. In Russia, there's a lot of collections, but what's amazing is, even here in your museum, in one of your libraries, the Bancroft Library, this gentleman by the name of Alphonse Pinard, his journals are here, his original journals, and I spent all day yesterday at the library looking at them. When he came to Kodiak in 1871-72, Alaska was sold in 1867. He came to Kodiak, he kayaked from Unalaska all the way up, being led by Wenongan men. But when he was in Kodiak, he spent 6 months, and he recorded songs and stories in archaic Alutiiq. It's the only recordings written down that we know of traditional Alutiiq songs in the world, and they're housed here in your library. And so the Bancroft has been wonderful to allow us access to them. But next slide. I've worked with my mom, and elders to translate the original Cyrillic Alutiiq. But I also went back to scholars' works, Dr. Lydia Black and Dr. Jeff Lear. I went back to their original translations as well to compare those. And this one here is called Amun, the old man. And up top you can see it's in Alutiiq, and then you got Russian, and then you got French. Next slide. So working with Jeff Lear, we basically broke down the sentences. And when we got down to looking at this here, I sat down with the elders, and when we were translating them, the elder, I was saying, well, Jeff Lear says this, and then Lydia Black says that. The elder looks at me and says, you can listen to them, but I've been speaking this language my whole life. This is what it says. And so I had to stop, and it spent 2 years retranslating all those songs. Next slide. And this is what we came up with. From Florence and my mom. Amun, naniuna tayo pa, aufna pa kanami, kinami pitach kunun aufkana. The old man, where is my helper? Will I find him down there? Who should I take the catch to, take the food to? And to me, when I was translating these, they were like poetry, but they're abstract. Of who do I go to find guidance from, to take my food to? How do I provide for my community? Working with, looking at an elder, the old man. And these are masks that Pinard collected. He also collected over 74 masks, which ended up in the Chateau Museum Boulogne-sur-Mer. So his journals are here, and the masks are over there. Lydia Black got a scholar and a student to actually look at them, Dominique Desson. She did her dissertation, but she never actually really combined the masks with the songs. And that was the other thing of trying to collaborate the songs. Written on the back of these, Pinard wrote in Russian the names of these masks. Next slide. In Boulogne-sur-Mer, there's a century of care. World War II, 85% of Boulogne was destroyed. The curators risked their lives moving these collections at night from the Germans. I mean, at that time when you were trying to save your own life, why would you save some wooden object? So to me, there's an amazing story that hasn't been told yet. That for us, it has enriched our culture in the last 10 years so much. We now have resources, creating resources that are accessible. So if anybody's interested, you can go and look at this information and learn from it. It's accessible, and that's the one thing I keep pushing, accessibility. It's great to do all this wonderful work, but how do you get it back home into the hands of your community members? Next slide. So you're sharing the knowledge, but you're also creating new stories. You're telling new stories, so it's living. St. Petersburg, largest collection of allutic objects in the world. Next slide. Raised $60,000 for the museum to publish a catalog on all the allutic material. They published in English, or published in Russian first, and in English through UAF Press. And that was 6 years of collaboration. The Chateau Musée de Boulogne-sur-Mer project was 8 years. And in the mask exhibit, I was turned down 5 times. No, can't do it. No, no, no. So I raised money to bring artisans over there. We did that, and then they realized the value of the collections to us. Jim Pepper-Henry was telling me that our museum, our cultural museum, was one of the first native museums to actually do that kind of exhibit, and to bring over 35 pieces was unheard of. So we set a foundation for other small museums to be able to do this. So it's not the burden of just the larger museums, but it's a burden of our own selves to be able to do that. And nobody can tell you no. Next. To bringing, if we can't get the collections back to Kodiak, we're going to take our artisans, we're going to take our scholars to there. So we raised money, we got money from IMLS, we brought grass weavers to Russia to study the collection at the Russian Ethnographic Museum. This is Coral Chernow. She was so inspired by that basket. It's like, when she came back, she spent a month and made that basket, which now resides at the Allutic Museum. So from an ethnographic piece that from 1909 to 2011, we now have an actual piece that will inspire more weavers that were not doing weaving. Next slide. To working with our even local museums, I'd say local, but East Coast, the Peabody Museum at Harvard. I was there doing repatriation, NAG for consultation. And one of the elders was looking at our collections, and we went to see this 3-man kayak because he wanted to see it, because I was telling him, oh, I saw this 3-man kayak, it's beautiful, because there's only like 2 or 3 of them in the world. And he's like, okay, great, we're up there. We climb up in these rafters, and he's not exactly the healthiest person. He'd already had 2 heart bypasses, so I'm worried about him having a heart attack in this. And we're hunched over on these things and, you know, hanging from scaffolds, literally. And he's like, hey, Fish, look at a kayak over there. I'm like, oh yeah, that's an Onongan kayak, which is, oh, that's from the Aleutians. He's like, come here closer, I'm going to slap you. Get over there and look at that kayak. So I climb over 2 other kayaks, and I'm looking at this kayak, and I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, he's right. It's an Allutic, or Soviet kayak. And that was in 2003. And I shared that with Trish Capone and Sandra and T. Rose, and then they never really let it go. They were able to raise funds to bring us back. And at that time I was working with Alfred Nomoff, who's the last traditional kayak maker. And we've been teaching kayak models, building in the villages and all that. But they got a grant, and we were able to go back and look at this kayak. It's the only known warrior's kayak, single-man warrior's kayak in the world, that has human hair sewn into it. And so we've been working on a collaboration, and that project will continue forward. They're going to be returning the kayak for a 10-year loan to Kodiak, so that it'll reside at Kodiak to be able to share that living knowledge. And Alfred's been able to learn more from that kayak because he was taught how to make kayaks. But that one also helped him bring back more information. Next slide. To April of 2012, we went down into their collections and archives. And we get down there like, oh my God, are you kidding? We'd seen models of double-bladed paddles, but there are no full-size blades, double-bladed paddles. And they had one there that was just labeled as a paddle. They have the only known full-size double-bladed paddle that we know of right now from our region. So I took a sketch, came home, shared it with several different artists. From April to May, one of our artisans had already made a double-bladed paddle based on that pattern. Within a month of us learning about it, We had a carver who already made another one based on the body proportions, accurate body proportions. So it's taking museum collections that were unknown and putting them back into a living context. And there have already been several paddles made on Kodiak. Next one. The other one here is more of a fun one. I always ask, like, oh, spoons. 15,000 people live in Kodiak, but we have no archaeological spoons. And you have soup. You have to use something. I asked my mom in 2011 in the summer, because I was kind of curious, what do you guys use? She's like, oh, we use clamshells. So I assumed you take the clamshell and you have that. That fall, I was down at the Sheldon Jackson Museum giving a presentation, and I asked the curator there, you guys have anything from Kodiak, like spoons? And she was like, yeah, we do. And so you look it up, she brings it out, and I'm like, oh my God, it's a clamshell spoon. And that's that spoon right there. All it is a stick, groove cut in it, clamshell. So now you guys know something of how to make a spoon no matter where you go if you're on the beach. If you guys get desperate, hey, I know how to make a spoon. There you go. So, living context, living knowledge. I went back and asked my mom, well, why didn't you tell me? She's like, well, you never asked. I'm like, ah. But still, it's oral history, ethnographic account, and I went back to the Burke Museum and I got the curator, the registrar, to look in the collections. They found a spoon handle that was labeled as a foreshaft for an arrow, mislabeled. So you have archaeological collection, ethnographic, and living tradition, living knowledge. Just in that simple spoon. But as an archaeologist, I look at that and I'm like, all those clamshells we threw away, oh wait, we have to reanalyze that. Because now we're looking at something that was used as a utensil. So what we learn from those also helps enrich just our understanding of the collections. And then, having the girls, like my daughter and that, making clamshell spoons for Girl Scouts. And they had fun with that. And I didn't, kind of just did it on a whim, and the kids still have them in their houses. Next one. 2, having other scholars contact us about things they find in high school gymnasiums in Finland. This hat here, I raised money for a spruce root hat from Kodiak. Had to raise over $250,000. This one, when I found it, it was stuffed into a box like this with things fold under, the flaps fold under, stuffed in there. They had no idea what they had. They had no idea that, not just the cultural value, but and this hat looked like it had been made yesterday. To the quiver, which was on exhibit for a Denine exhibit this last fall at Anchorage Museum. To the Kiksadi tribe, and I mentioned the 300 men who had died. We did a celebration with the Kiksadi tribe in 2011. 2011 was a really big year. But they gifted 6 songs they had kept alive for our tribe. We had thought our songs had died. And they had kept on singing those songs for over a century. They invited us down as a tribe, and I got dancers from all the villages to go down to Sitka, and the Kiksadi tribe sang those songs. They gifted them back to us by singing them for us to have back in our own community. I've been told my whole life, oh, we war with them. They're our enemies. Why would an enemy keep songs alive for us that can be sung again? And all of this comes back to what we've been doing through the museum, of building trust within our community, building trust amongst each other, so that we can share the knowledge, so it's shared in a respectful way. Next slide. And this one here, the whale's out, so let's talk. Let's collaborate. Let's work with the different communities. Because our voices are very, very important. But repatriating that knowledge in a way that says, yes, this is a history we are living with, but we can change it. But we have to do it ourselves. Next slide. So that it is a bit dignity within our community, within our future. And then the next one. To being stewards of our land. By raising ourselves to be healthier, we can continue to care for where we're at. Because by living healthier, we know that everything else needs to be healthier around us as well. Excellent. More importantly, through the internet, through all of that, our world is really small. And we can share our voices. I had the privilege of going down to a textile conference in Oaxaca, and I got to go to Monte Alban, but what was really more important is, next slide, is looking at what the local community members are doing. Bringing back traditional colors, traditional textiles, celebrating who they are culturally, themselves. Yeah, it's part of an economic gain, but at the same time, what they then do is they're raising their children to be healthier, to have a voice. Yes. Two, all the way around the world in the Orkneys, where they're using their history as a way to protect their own community, but also celebrate it with the globe. On that side. And here's the important things for you to think about. We can't change the past, but we can change the future. Each of you holds this power to change by understanding our past and using this knowledge. No matter the challenges, we live in a global society and it's only getting smaller. Find ways to collaborate and trust each other to do the right thing. Our history, our lives, our future. The repatriation of knowledge to each of our community members, to each of us as individuals. To be able to do, last slide, to like that knowledge so that it's living, or as my mom had told me, that which is within deserves respect. By respecting that, you respect yourself and you pass that on. And to me, that's what museums and the work that we do has and does for us as community members.